You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you as always. It's a Wednesday. It's a great day. It's sunny outside. It's still cold, but it's sunny, and we got a lot to talk about today. So a lot of things have transpired. The transfer portal is closed, which, you know, January is always that month where it's pretty bleak and boring and slow. But it's January 21st, and the month rolled by because of the transfer portal, in my opinion. So, if there's something to be happy about to get you moving through the month, I guess there's that. So, all right. Well, we've got a lot to talk about. So today we're going to talk about Utah and the Indiana title-winning model, a look at the Utah football schedule that was released today for the 2026 season, a final look at the AP Top 25 rankings, a transfer portal recap, and if we have time, we'll finally get back to revisiting the Hot Takes episode from last year. I just think it's a little fun look back, and we'll see what we've got. So we'll jump into that. But before, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Big dreams don't just belong in your imagination. At Canyon View Credit Union, we help turn those dreams into reality. From application to celebration, we're by your side every step of the way, because home isn't just a place, it's the people you share it with. At Canyon View Credit Union, flexible options and expert guidance help you create a home that's truly yours, the perfect place to gather and belong. Guiding you home, Canyon View Credit Union. To learn more details, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's just jump into this. So on Monday was the national championship game, and Indiana came out on top. And honestly, what a storybook season. They go 16-0, and really just kind of defied all logic and reason for what was going to transpire. It's been a blue bloods world, and there hasn't been many others outside of your traditional teams that you think of when you think of the Blue Bloods that have won a national championship. So Indiana gets in there and just like I said, defies odds. And what a cool story! I mean, it's a team that they're not spending the most out there. They're not recruiting the top end talent and doing all that. They're doing it their own way and doing it in a way that was efficient and effective, and in a lot of ways absolutely dominated teams, especially in the Big Ten. So really cool model that you're going to start seeing, right? Like you're going to start seeing a lot of these programs around the country try to adopt an Indiana model, whatever that means, and we're going to get into that here shortly. But you're going to see a lot of teams, one, believe that they can now win a championship, because if Indiana can, anybody can, right? A 2-year span where Curt Cignetti really just kind of revamped the entire program and outlook of Indiana. Now they're going to be the cream of the crop, where those top-tier talent that top-tier talent is going to start coming to Indiana, and there's going to be, an infusion of cash because, people want to go there. It's just kind of flipped everything on its head, and you're going to see a lot of different things change in Indiana. But I truly believe that Curt Cignetti is going to keep things rolling the same way, right? He's not going to suddenly change who he is because it's worked, and he's gotten proven success wherever he's gone that he can do it. Obviously, this is the highest level, and doing what he did at James Madison is great, but doing that at Indiana and winning a national championship, there's not much that can compete with that. So just for a reference, though, this is the first non-blue blood, at least the ones that we consider to be a non-blue or a blue blood, since 1991 in Washington. Some will say that Washington is a top team, but they're not a blue blood. Let's be real. They haven't had the sustained success that many programs around the country have. You could throw Clemson in there as being one of the non-blue bloods, but I think everybody considers them as that because of their rise. So you can kind of get a little flexible with that with Clemson, but outside of that, it's really just been a real blue blood level situation. Looking back on this, the last national champions at least in the college football era, the Big Ten has 4. They're on a 3-year streak. So you've got Indiana, obviously, this last year. Ohio State the year before, Michigan the year before, and then in the 2014 season, that was Ohio State. So they've done well. Beyond that, the SEC has kind of run the college football era. They have 6 national championships during that time when it started. So you had Georgia in the 2022 season, Georgia again in 21, Alabama in the 20 season, LSU 19 season, Alabama in 17 and 15 they won those. So you have all of those teams. The ACC obviously has Clemson in 2018 and 2016, and no Big 12 team has won a national title in the college football era. So a lot to do there. Even if you look at this, the last time a team from the Big 12 has won a national championship was 2005, and that was Texas in the iconic Rose Bowl game that everybody talks about with USC. Phenomenal game, but let's be real, Texas is no longer in the Big 12 and is in the SEC. So the last time a current member of the Big 12 has won a national championship, you have to go back 36 years to the 1990 season where Colorado won. Before that, it was BYU in 1984. You're starting to get into eras of college football where there wasn't a consensus on national championships. You could argue that the BCS provided some stability to that and started giving you at least a look at what was going on. But the true look at where this has been lately is through the playoffs, right? The 4-team playoffs, now the 12-team playoffs. Maybe it expands to 16 or 24, however, these conferences want to fight it out. But during that time, it's really just been a blue blood world. And the Big 12 is the last one out looking at this saying, they've got to get there. Texas Tech, obviously was hoping to be that this last year, but that didn't work out. So getting back to kind of the Indiana model, that was just kind of more context to how this was so rare. Indiana did it their own way, right? And when you look at this, the Indiana model does fit similarly with Utah. And look, like I'm using this in a way as some context to help Utah kind of see where it's possible or where it was done with Indiana. Every program around the country is going to be doing the exact same thing, right? So this is not unique to just Utah. I will say Utah follows some of these characteristics a little bit closer than some around the country. But this is going to be, scrutinized and analyzed, and every team in the country is going to now look at this and say, hey, if they can do it, we can do it. Like, we get that. So this isn't some novel concept of me over here like, oh, wait, Utah might have cracked the code with Indiana. Like, no, this is not, proprietary stuff here. But just kind of looking how Utah can kind of be in that world, right? You look at how Indiana did it. First, they had older or mature players, right? It was just guys that have had experience in the system, and they weren't necessarily your stars in the programs. They weren't 5-star guys that were coming in and they were just older, and Indiana did well with them. They just got experience, and that kind of leads to that other area where it's production over potential. Now that's not just a black and white situation, right? Like, you're not just getting guys that are only producing and you're never looking for potential. Like, if you never did that, you would kind of undercut a lot of what works in college football, right? You still have to recruit. You still have to find guys that there is potential, right? But when you're leaning on people to be able to make the plays for you, to be able to be the core of the team, you've got to find production. And there's so many programs around the country, and Utah was included in this, especially the last few years, where you kind of start chasing stars, right? You're trying to chase the talent, hoping that they will produce for you. And in some respects, that's worked for Utah, but Utah has found that it's honestly been more of the productive type guys, maybe at the lower level, G5 or even lower, where, where you can have a guy that has been effective in a lower level and bring them up, where you can bring them up and, utilize them in a capacity because they're experienced players. They've seen the game, and it may be at a different level, and they're not quite up to the Power 4 level right yet, but you're seeing them able to produce. And if you can find production in college, there's at least a connection there where it looks like it can translate, right? And so you're going to see that now, especially with Morgan Scalley. He's much more aligned to that idea of production over potential. Once again, that's not to say that Utah won't be looking for potential. You have to. You're trying to identify guys that you believe can get in there and be productive in time. Hopefully you can keep them on your roster as a depth player and eventually move them into a starting caliber role. But it's trying to find the players that can be productive. And so, whether you want to say they're not chasing stars or it's a money ball situation, I don't truly believe that's the same situation. This isn't a full money ball era. It's just more trying to find guys that have experience. And Utah already, BYU and Utah always have this knock where, oh, well, they have missionaries, so they're older. That helps them. Maybe that's the case, right? They still have to come in, and after 2 years of not playing football, which is very, very tough, or in some cases 1 year of not playing football, come in and try to relearn kind of all the things that they did leading up to that point. But there is something to it where you get more mature players, guys that are bought into a system. They're not looking elsewhere. They're just buying into that system. That leads to a next point with Curt Cignetti, is he was the ultimate disciplinarian. Not in the sense of, he's cruel and it was tough. It was more just like holding every single player accountable. And there's a story out there, and I don't know the full specifics of it. I heard this earlier this week. I'm so sorry. My throat just decided to close off. There was a story earlier this week where talking about how one of their star players, was late to meetings and doing things that really just didn't help the team. And Cignetti just said, okay, it's time to cut him loose. And a lot of people looked at that as confused. Like, you've got one of your star players, you've got to kind of keep him. And it just kind of comes down to, like, nobody is above this, right? If you're not willing to buy into the system and you're not willing to pull in the same direction as everybody else, you're not worth having. You can be the greatest football player in all the world, but if you're not pulling in the same direction and you're, a diva, or you're doing the things that go contrary to what Cignetti and the coaching staff are trying to preach, it's not going to work. And you saw that on the field. You saw an Indiana team that just did not make mistakes. Now, they make mistakes, right? Every team does that, but you rarely got penalties. I mean, that false start near the end of the game really was just such a rare penalty that this team has, because they just are disciplined. They understand what they have to do. They don't make mistakes, and it works, right? I don't know the stat, but there's something like they had 1,100 snaps since their last fumble. This is a team that bought into every fundamental aspect of football. And you can say, oh, well, it's the Nick Saban type of way. Well, there's many coaches that have coached with Nick Saban. Yes, Curt Cignetti did coach with him. But there's many coaches that have coached under Nick Saban, and they haven't had that success. Many have, but it's not just a Nick Saban way. This was the Curt Cignetti way, and he did it the right way. He also developed players. You're coming in there, you're taking players from James Madison, and there's no knock on James Madison. They've been a phenomenal program from the FCS rank now up to the FBS, where they get into the college football playoff. This is a program that has been really effective, and Cignetti is a reason for that to some extent. But you're finding guys that can be developed. Now, when I say all that, that's a lot of how Utah has tried to operate, right? You're trying to find guys that have been in the system. They're productive. You're trying to hold them accountable through discipline. Now, you could probably go a little bit further and try to get more discipline there. You can go for production over potential. You can develop these players. Utah has, for the longest time under Kyle Whittingham, was considered one of the best schools for developing talent, taking lower-tiered players, so to speak, or lower-rated players, and developing them into, maybe NFL caliber players or starting caliber players that are impactful on the field. That fits the Utah model, and that's not going to change under Morgan Scalley. If anything, I think Morgan Scalley fits this Cignetti model a little bit more, where there's the production over potential. The last few years of Whittingham's tenure, not necessarily last year, but the years leading up to that, there was a little bit of chasing the stars. You were looking at it and saying, okay, now we have some money. Let's go try to get a high-end talent. And that didn't always translate to a cohesion on the field or in the practice or in the locker room. It became a problem. And so it's really just trying to find the guys that are Utah guys, right? Trying to do that in a way that is everybody bought in. And last year you saw a lot more of that, where everybody was pulling in the same direction. The reason Utah had so much success last year, yes, it was because of their on-field stuff. but there was a lot of pulling in the same direction, a lot of people buying into the same system. There wasn't diva roles. Devin Dampier could have been the ultimate diva and just been like, look, I'm the star of this team. Don't let Bird Ficklin on the field. Don't, do that. Like, there could have been so many areas where this could have been a disaster. And yet they were all pulling in the same direction because they had many of those same characteristics that worked. And you get an 11-win season for the fourth time in program history. Like, this isn't something to be, just kind of glossed over. This is something that was really effective. And yeah, the crazy part is, even with that, you didn't make the Big 12 title game. You didn't get into the college football playoffs. You only lost 2 games, but it shows how close you can be. And if Scalley and his coaching staff and the players that he's brought in can continue to lead in that direction, you can make similar jumps, right? Scalley's not shy about saying that Utah can be a national championship winning team. Obviously, there takes some luck aspects to that. There takes a lot of hard work and dedication to get there. And even when you do that, as you kind of saw this last year, you may not even sniff it. Now, granted, you lost 2 games and clearly weren't the better team, but you can see how difficult of a path that is. I think most years you're not going to get an undefeated team. I'm not going to go quite out there and say, especially since we saw it with Indiana, that you'll never see an undefeated team again. But I think this is kind of how razor thin it is, right? You can have the best thing. You can follow the Cignetti model perfectly. And I hate to call it the Cignetti model because it's not just him, but obviously he's the latest to do it. But you can follow all of those things perfectly and do it the way that it works, and you still may not get close. The reality is you've got to do it the way that you need to do it. Scalley's can't be chasing what Cignetti's doing. Scalley can't be chasing what Kyle Whittingham did. He's got to be chasing the way that he wants to do it, and he has to live in that world. And if it doesn't work, you adjust and you do different things that help that. But you've got to find the Utah way, so to speak, and make that work. If it does resemble some of these other programs and it does resemble Indiana, all the better, right? Because you've clearly seen that model works. The reality is it's more just that Indiana showed that there is a path to be done. It's still a lot of hard work, and there's a lot of things that need to be done. You don't have to spend top dollar to do it. Granted, in this day and age, that helps, right? You kind of do need to have some money. And it's not like Indiana didn't have money, right? Cignetti said it was somewhere around 23 to 25 million, if I'm not mistaken. So they had money, right? But they're not the 40 million, 50 million that some of these other programs around the country are doing. It's really just getting guys to buy into your system and utilizing it in a way that is effective for that team. What Cignetti's doing this year may not work next year. It may not work in years to come, right? He's going to start getting more talent, and he's going to start getting more stars coming onto his roster. And those are good things, because now if he can do that with, lower rated players, think of what you can do with higher rated players. But they all have to buy in. You can't just chase the stars. On top of that, Cignetti, he didn't run long practices. If I remember right, he ran 1.5 hour long practices. This wasn't a daily grind where it's like from sun up to sundown, you're only focused on football. Obviously, there has to be some discipline, and you have to study, and you have to go film, and you have to have guys that are bought in. But you don't need to continue to work these guys for 2-3 hours to get a point, right? You got to keep these guys healthy. You got to keep them safe. You got to have the endurance. To win 16 games, you have to have some endurance. And if you're going 3 hours every single day and everything is tough, that's not going to be easy. And maybe that goes a little bit contrary to the way Whittingham ran things. Obviously, they're a hard-nosed team, but you can see that Indiana was a hard-nosed team as well. They didn't have the best trenches, right? It's not like when you look at them and you say, oh, they had the best defensive line or they had the best offensive line. They were great offensive and defensive lines, but they weren't the best out there. And yet they still found ways to get it done because they were fundamentally sound, they didn't make mistakes, and they were all pulling in the same direction. So can Utah follow that model? We'll see, right? Like, there's a lot of questions here for Morgan Scalley. This isn't just, oh, well, Morgan inherited the roster of an 11-2 season, and suddenly everything is going to be cake. No, this is still going to be hard work, and Scalley has to own up to what he does best. And I think you're already seeing that in kind of how he has approached the transfer portal, which we'll talk about here shortly. You've seen that how he's allowing his coaches to kind of be a little bit more free. They're doing it in a different way. We'll ultimately learn a lot more in spring, and then ultimately this year in the fall where we get to see that. But if Utah is chasing somebody else's model, it's not going to work. That model can still be similar, but they've got to do it the Utah way, whatever that is. And we're going to learn what Morgan Scalley and the Utah way is moving forward. But I think when you look at this, you can say there is a path forward. And it's not just like this pie in the sky situation. Now, like I said, it's not just, okay, we want to win a national championship and that's kind of it. There's a lot of hard work and luck and everything that goes into it. But I'm really curious to see how Utah embraces this, how other programs around the country embrace this, especially knowing that it's not just blue blood driven. It's still going to be blue bloods, let's be real. But there is now a scenario where other programs around the country have a lot more optimism going into this. The 12-team playoff especially allowed that. And it's not like Indiana snuck in, right? Indiana was a number 1 seed. They also dominated teams. They dominated all of these teams that they had to play. So it's not like it was just these close wins. It was just like, well, fluke field goal suddenly here, and Indiana's in the title game. No, this is a team that lived out its plan to the full extent. With that said, yes, there may be situations where a team sneaks in. You look at Miami, where they were number 10. They got in and suddenly made it to the national championship game. Now, granted, Miami's much more of a blue blood than Indiana, but there's scenarios here where once you get access to that, there's opportunity. And I think that's where, Utah needs to look. They need to look that if we can get into the playoffs, we have a shot. It's still tough beyond that, right? Now you're going against the top of teams, but you've got a shot. But there's so much that needs to be done behind the scenes to do it the Utah way. So really fascinated to see how that goes, right? You can call it the Indiana way. You can call it the Cignetti way. I just think, Utah can follow a similar model because they are already operating in that model and just do it the Utah way. Will it result in a national championship? I don't know. Like I said, that's a really tall task. But I think if Utah can continue to move forward and stack what they've been doing already, there's an opportunity, right? So we'll see. All right, that leads us to the Big 12 schedule release that took place this morning. And so now we know what the 2026 schedule looks like. It's been talked about that this is a pretty weak schedule for Utah, just namely on the opponents. We don't fully know, right? Like, it's really easy to look at this on paper and say, okay, this team is going to be weak, this team's going to be good, yada, yada, yada. I mean, last year we saw, I truly believed that Baylor was going to be a good team because they were returning a majority of their roster. ASU, I thought they were going to take a step back, but thought they would still be good, and they remained pretty good despite Sam Leavitt being injured and some other drama. You've got a lot of these other teams that on paper they may be good or bad, and we just don't know. If I was making my preseason Big 12 rankings, I'm most likely, and obviously this is going to change when we really digest what the transfer portal is and how these teams come together through spring. But I would obviously put Texas Tech at number 1. I'd probably put BYU at number 2. They didn't really lose anybody, and they have a lot of holdover. Granted, the coaching changes is going to be really fascinating to see what they do there. Utah number 3. And then 4 or 5, I'm just going to go with 5. I'm not going to go the full 16. But 4 or 5, I'm going to probably put Arizona and Houston in whichever order you want. Now, with that said, many of these other teams out there could be significantly better. Suddenly Oklahoma State could be a factor, right? They've rebuilt. Maybe even though Iowa State has gone through a complete roster rebuild, maybe they're in the mix. Maybe West Virginia gets something done with Rich Rod. It's tough to know, right? Maybe even TCU to that level. I would doubt TCU to at least the top level, but they were still around in the mix. Maybe it's Cincinnati, like there's so many things here where it's like, okay, well, this is an easy schedule. Well, yeah, on paper it looks that way right now. But for the most part, you never really know what you're going to get until it's games played. So with that context, think of how the teams were this last year, but there's so much that has changed, especially in coaching changes or roster turnover, that's going to make this difficult. Here's what the situation is, though. Utah will get 7 home games this year. So all 3 non-conference games will be played at Rice-Eccles Stadium, starting with Idaho, so an FCS opponent, Idaho, in your very first game on September 3rd. You then welcome an SEC opponent in Arkansas the week after, and then you close out non-conference play with Utah State. This very much so is the old Chris Hill model of ABC type scheduling, which is, I don't think that's a bad situation. And that Utah State game is going to be even tougher than maybe you expect. Bronco Mendenhall has really coming into his own. Arkansas, what do they look like now with a lot of the changes that they've had? Then you get Iowa State as your first Big 12 game, and it's on the road. We really don't know what Iowa State's going to look like. But traveling to Ames, Iowa, what does that look like? Is Utah done well in the first 3 games of the season? We'll see what happens there. That could be a really fascinating game, but it's going to be the first true test for Utah coming into. Arkansas is obviously going to be a test, but I think in terms of Big 12 play, Iowa State's going to be that true test. And then, unfortunately for Utah, they get the bye week right after that. And there's only one bye week this year. So you get the bye week, and then it's suddenly 8 straight games after a bye. So, it can work well if you've got some early injuries or things aren't going well for you, and maybe you need to retune and do different things that way. But beyond that, it's going to be a challenge to be able to have to then go win 8. And then if you get to the Big 12 championship, you've got, the week after. So it essentially could be 9 straight weeks of playing a game without a bye. And then if you somehow make it to the playoff, you get a little bit more of a break. But then it's just a lot of wear and tear on the body. So Utah can't really make a lot of mistakes here. And every team in the Big 12 is going to get one bye this year. So it's not like Utah's being picked on here. But I think this now more than last year, it changes how Utah has to kind of advance that. The home opener for Big 12 play is against Kansas on October 10th, so right after the bye. And then it's really just kind of an alternating schedule between home and away, except for near the end of the season where Utah has to go to Arizona and TCU in back-to-back weeks and then close out the season at home against West Virginia. Utah does get Houston at home. You also get BYU at home. And like I said, West Virginia to close out the season. The BYU game does fall in November this year, but it's still not the end of the season. It's the very first part of November. So, it's a little later in the schedule, I guess you could say, by like a week or two, but it's still not where it needs to be. I think this last year, especially with what was on the line, you really missed having that be a rivalry weekend, right? Imagine being able to say both of these teams have one loss going into that last game of the season, and whoever wins gets into the Big 12 title game to face Texas Tech. That's a completely different feel. And obviously, this game doesn't need any added juice, but when you've got a conference title on the line, there's some drama right there. And I think that would be a lot of fun. But I also understand the Big 12 and wanting to schedule it in a week where it can be a little bit more premier. I just don't know that there's ever going to be a scenario where that fully works, and that makes a lot of sense. So it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that Utah's closing out the season with West Virginia, the hated rival of West Virginia that they've played so many times. But, Rich Rod on the sidelines going a little berserk at times is never not fun to watch. So, there's stuff there that can be done. Road games, Utah goes to Colorado and Cincinnati as well. Cincinnati is played on Halloween. I don't know that factors into anything, but, for those that are interested in that kind of stuff. So there's that. The thing here is Utah doesn't have Texas Tech or Arizona State on the schedule. So, there's possibilities there where this looks easier. But like I said, Houston is going to be tough. Arizona seems like it should be tough. Some of these other programs could very well be tough and a real challenge. Some other notable takeaways here. When Utah plays Colorado, they're coming in, Utah's coming into Boulder with Colorado having a bye week. So they get 2 weeks to prepare for Utah. Really curious to see what Colorado does this year. They've rebuilt a ton in the portal again, but, they do that every year, and it just hasn't fully worked. So curious to see what happens there. Utah's game against Cincinnati. Cincinnati gets Texas Tech the week before at home. That's going to be a tough game. So, I'd have to imagine Cincinnati loses that game, and they're going to be looking for a win at home against Utah. But, that's going to be, TBD. BYU plays ASU the week before. We don't really know what ASU is going to be, but they've done really well in the transfer portal and really cleaned up. So I'd have to imagine that ASU is going to factor into that. I forgot to put them in my list. They're probably in there at 6th or something, 4 through 6 in my opinion. And there's that. Arizona plays TCU the week before Utah. Who knows what that'll be. And then West Virginia plays Houston the week before Utah. At that point in the season, you very well know what West Virginia is. You know what Houston is. You know what Utah is. So I don't know that one matters as much. But, if Houston is in the mix and Utah's in the mix for a Big 12 title, that game very well could, have an impact in how Utah plays. So Really curious there. So nothing too dramatic from this schedule. I think it lays out fairly well with, back-to-back, one back-to-back road game. It can be a tough one with Arizona and TCU, but Arizona is a familiar place for Utah. TCU obviously is a familiar place as well. It's not too daunting as we sit here in January, but that could change as we see how these teams develop and grow in spring and kind of how the things manage there. So that's it for the Big 12 schedule release. Let's jump into the final AP Top 25 rankings. So Utah finishes the season ranked number 14th, inside the top 15. This is actually just the sixth time in school history that the program has finished inside the top 15. So once again, not a bad landing spot. I think the way that Utah ended the season, obviously not being in the title game, giving up a ton of yards in the run game to both Kansas State and Kansas, kind of left a little bit of sour note on the season. But then you had the Las Vegas Bowl, which absolutely changed the script, and you feel better about it. But I think it's still kind of lost that Utah won 11 games. Coming into the season, many were, I think their over-under was 7.5 from Vegas. And so many were looking at 8 as being, can they even get there? I was more around 9 or 10 as my kind of limit, but never did we expect it to be as effective as it was, right? And I still think many Utah fans, and me included, as I look at it from an outsider perspective here, is I think Utah had chances, right, where they could have at least won one more game. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way, and the teams that won moved on and we're in the Big 12 title game. But I think if you're Utah, you're looking at that as we went 11-2, and there's a real possibility that we could have done better, and not just we think that things could have changed in our favor. No, there's legitimate opportunities, especially from that BYU game, where if not for some blown calls on fourth down, there's a real possibility that Utah is in the Big 12 title game instead of BYU. So really fascinating situation. Good opportunity for Utah, but now it's about continuing that success, right? It's great to be inside the top 15 in the final poll. It just shows that you were clearly one of the better teams, but it got you nothing in the sense that you didn't get into the playoff. And that's the ultimate goal for this program. And, if you're not admitting that you won a national title, I don't know that you're fully serious, right? Now, within reason, right? I don't think Oklahoma State is coming into the season believing that they can win a national title. Maybe. I don't know. But I think this is, you have to be realistic, but I think Utah truly believes that they can get into the playoffs, they can be competitive, and work well. There were some flaws, right? Obviously, the defensive line and allowing a lot of the run did not help, and that would have been exposed even worse in the playoff. But I think Utah feels like it's close. And so you've got to continue to build on that. You obviously get Devin Dampier back, Bird Ficklin back, you get Wayshawn Parker, you get a whole host of transfers that are coming in, and I'll get that shortly. But you've got a lot of opportunity available to you to be able to build on what Utah did last year. But it all has to come together. You all have to be in the same page like we talked about earlier. Other Big 12 teams ranked in the final AP Top 25. Texas Tech falls to number 7. Obviously, they didn't show up as well in the playoff, so they fall to 7. BYU finishes at 11. Houston finishes at 22. TCU at 25. And then Arizona is the last team to receive votes. So all those teams get in there. And like I said, I think all of those teams are kind of in the mix. I don't know about TCU. We'll see. I think they're an interesting study to see if they can kind of be in that mix. They lose Josh Hoover, but what do they do to be better? And we'll break down all those things this summer in the off season, like we did the last couple of years, where we go game by game and everything that way. But I think this shows that the future is bright for Utah. I don't think you can just suddenly baseline Utah as a top 15 going into the 2026 season. But I think they're going to be close, right? I think you've got a bunch of these teams that they're not going to move a ton. Texas Tech, BYU, Houston, Utah, all these teams I think are going to be in the mix because of what they've done. And so, whether Utah is in the top 15 to start the season this year remains to be seen. But I think having kind of the core of your offense together is going to afford Utah a lot more leeway. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they're a top 15 team coming into this season. All right, let's jump to the transfer portal recap. So as I mentioned, the portal closed over the weekend. There's still roughly about 48-hour business days before, everything is finally settled. But Utah really settled theirs pretty well, early on. Jason Stokes Jr. did enter the portal a little late into the calendar, but he was looked to be a little further down on the depth chart in the corner room, especially with what Utah added, and so it just wasn't. I don't want to call it as impactful, right? Because every transfer is impactful in a certain way, but I think it wasn't as damning as it could be. So, all in all, Utah, considering what it could have been with Kyle Whittingham going to Michigan, it wasn't as damaging as was expected. With that said, obviously there's key players, especially starters, that went to Michigan that are going to hurt, right? You look at John Henry Daly, who, we've talked about being who he is and what he did for Utah this year, but understanding that he had an Achilles injury that is not going to be conducive to getting back quickly. If he does at Michigan, all the more power to him. I just don't know that was something that Utah wanted to risk. And so losing him is unfortunate. Smith Snowden obviously wanted to go to the portal beforehand, and so he ends up at Michigan. You had Teo Johnson, a starting safety, end up at UCLA. You had who am I missing? There's a bunch of other players that I'm missing here. Jonah Liea. You had I know there's one big player. Oh, J.J. Buchanan obviously was one that was not expected. He was planning to come back to Utah and then decided last minute to come to Michigan. But all in all, Utah did fairly well in retaining the players that they needed. You do miss some players, but I think Utah did well to be able to at least keep the core of their players together and do what they need to move forward. And then in the transfer portal, you picked up players that were of need. Now, on paper, some of these players look underwhelming, right? Like, I think there's many, when you look at their stats, they look great. Others where it's just like, okay, you got another FCS kid, or you got a guy that didn't produce at another school. Like, we're ultimately going to have to learn that, right? In my last episode, if you want to go back and listen to it, a lot of the guys, I talked about kind of their production and what's there. There's a lot of guys here that have starting potential, right? I think namely some of your bigger guys are Braden Pagan and Kyrie Scholes, two wide receivers that produced at the Mountain West level, put up, a combined, I think it's like 1,500 yards or something like that. I don't have that stat right there with me. But you've got two guys that can be productive there. You've got Steve Chavez Soto, the running back from San Jose State, who absolutely can be in the two deep for Utah, backing up Wayshawn Parker and mixing that in. You've got other guys like Ethan Day or Jamal Wallace or James Chenault, Elijah Reed, a lot of guys that can be early factors on the defensive side of the ball where Utah is in need of some change. So there's a lot of production here, and then there's some other guys that have some production with a little bit more potential involved there. But I think all in all, Utah did what they needed to fix some holes, right? You obviously needed to get some more depth on the offensive line, and they get Cedric Jefferson from Montana State and Isaiah Kema from Ohio State. You add that, but you already had a decent core there. You're getting some guys back that allows you to be consistent, and so you build there. You also get Kelvin Obot, who's the freshman 5-star tackle, so that you get that. You needed more depth at defensive line, and not even just more depth, more bigger bodies, and you get that in Jamal Wallace, Jeremo, Lucas Samsula. You get guys that can kind of fit that position and add some beef to that room. On the edge, you get Ethan Day, who was productive at North Texas, Nicholas Igua, a JUCO guy who was originally committed to Boise State but decided to opt out and come to Utah because he felt like there was a better opportunity there. You build up in your corner room again and find guys that have the size and have production who've done well. Like, Utah found where they needed to and plug those holes. Now, we'll see, right? We've got to see in spring how that's going to come together, how Scalley's operation is going to work, and if this actually is something that can be effective for Utah. But the fact that they could have lost so many players from the portal to Michigan and what they were able to keep, especially with keeping Devin Dampier and Bird Ficklin and Wayshawn Parker, those three alone do a ton for you. To not say anything about all the other stars of the team that are effective, right? Like, there's a lot of opportunities for Utah to take what they did this year and continue to run with that success. So Really, really fascinated to see how this works. Utah ultimately adds 17 players through the portal. There may be an add here or there, but I think Utah's pretty well done at adding from the portal. That puts them roughly above 85 players on the roster of scholarship guys. There's some walk-on guys in there as well that we'll learn as well. But for the most part, Utah has its full complement of players that they feel like they're going to utilize for the 2026 season. And all in all, on paper, it seems like a success. We'll see how that translates. There's a lot of moving pieces, but I think Utah's done well. And I'm not just saying that because I cover Utah. I think Utah really did attack this in a right way and trying to get the guys that they want. Did they miss on players? Sure. But they also got fairly close to what they wanted in pretty much everything. And yeah, some of those are guys that are lower levels, many from the Mountain West or the FCS ranks, maybe even JUCO. But Utah did well to be able to fill the gaps that they had there. So really fascinated to see how spring comes together. Really fascinated to see how Morgan Scalley operates with all this and what Utah's able to do. But I think it's a net positive on paper right now. It's hard to say because you did lose a lot of starter caliber players to Michigan and others, but many, like I said, many of those players were planning on leaving anyway before Kyle Whittingham even accepted a head coaching job at Michigan. So you were getting some of those guys that were going to go shopping beforehand. It just so happened that they could follow their coach to a blue blood and have kind of that attraction there. So it is what it is. All right, let's close the episode with some of the bold takes revisited. And, I think this is kind of fun. I went back and listened to the episode that I had with Josh Newman and Brian Brown. We each went through kind of a snake draft of taking bold takes for the season. And it was entertaining to listen to again and kind of our reasons for some of these things. And I'm not going to get into the rationale or some of the nuances here. But we had quite a bit of bold takes, and many of them hit. Others were not so great, but it was a lot of fun. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to that, it was back on August 13th, so you can go listen to that and see kind of how we reacted before the season to what was going to happen. But I think for the most part, we were fairly, I think as a collective, we were pretty spot on in kind of how we were approaching this team. It didn't fully shake out the way that everybody expected it to, but at the same time, it wasn't that far off either, if that makes sense. So jumping into this, the first hot take was from Brian Brown, but his was more of kind of a funny one, so I'm not going to get into that. So I was the first one with a take about Utah, and that was that Devin Dampier throws for 3,000 yards and rushes for 1,000. So obviously he didn't get that. He passed for 2,490, had 24 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. He did miss a game, but still, you're not getting there. Maybe you get close to 3,000, but I also think that we all knew, but Utah really put an emphasis on running the ball, and so that was split a little bit. I think that number outside of the 1,000-yard rushing may be more realistic for Dampier this year. I think there's going to be a heavier emphasis on passing the ball, so I could see him going over 3,000 yards, assuming he stays healthy for the entirety of the season. And he'll still factor in the run game, but I don't know that it'll be that high. So, if I was going to preview immediately right now, I'd probably go more like 3,000 passing yards and maybe 600 rushing yards next year. So we'll see. He did finish with 835 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns. So he was decently close to 1,000, decently close on both of those numbers, but it was a miss. But still kind of shows the impact that Dampier had on the program and what he did. Newman's first one was starting 9-0 and showing up in Waco with everything to play for. This one pained him to say because he really didn't want to say this, but I think he really believed that there was a shot there. And, in a perfect world, maybe, right? Utah shows up with a healthy Devin Dampier. Do they show up better against Texas Tech? Does that pass to Jackson Benny from Dampier that went for a touchdown early in the game that was called back because of an ineligible man downfield? Does that change the tone of the game? Do the 2 fumbles change the tone of the game? I mean, there's a lot there where Utah walks out of Rice-Eccles Stadium with a win instead of Texas Tech. Granted, yes, Texas Tech dominated, right? We get it. Then there's the BYU game in that stretch where, a couple fourth down plays change and suddenly Utah wins that game. So, really, really close. I think the question there was going into Baylor with everything to play for, assuming that Baylor was going to be a team that they needed to have a tough game to play to kind of get to the Big 12 title game, and that just didn't happen. Baylor just really fell off last year, was a shell of what everybody expected, and so, fascinating. But Utah does go 7-2 in that stretch, and ultimately after their second loss, so to BYU, they never lost again. So really, really solid season. I don't think Newman was that far off there, but at the same time, it wasn't a hit. So as part of the snake draft, Newman got to choose again, and this is one of my favorite ones because it was so obvious, but it's so funny how it changed. And this is Kyle Whittingham's last season at Utah. And man, what a dramatic turn of events that was, right? So nothing needs to be said there. Just, it happened, so we'll count that as a win. But at the same time, the way it happened and everything that happened after the fact is a completely different story that could write its own book. So fun little side note there. Not on anybody's radar that he would actually take another head coaching job, but win one for us because we predicted that Kyle Whittingham, who was presumably going to retire, was going to be done at Utah. So I was up next with J.J. Buchanan is a top 3 receiver for the Utes. And guess what? J.J. Buchanan was the number 3 leading receiver for the Utes. And a lot of that had to do with what he did in the Las Vegas Bowl, but hey, I got my prediction right. So Ryan Davis finished the season with 725 yards to lead the team. Dallin Bentley, tight end, got 620 yards, and then J.J. Buchanan at 427 yards. So win one for me. That was great, and obviously showed kind of what his potential could be, and now he gets to try that out at Michigan. But I think, the two parties, Utah and Buchanan, couldn't come to a number that worked, and ultimately he decided to go to Michigan. But, you lose a player that had a lot of upside. Really fascinated to kind of see how he develops and how Utah fills that void. But I think you've got a lot of other players that can potentially fill that void. Obviously, you got to find a connection for Dampier because his 3 leading receivers are now gone. And Ryan Davis was his safety net, especially early because of the connection that they'd built. They worked up through the scout team at New Mexico to being able to play at Utah in the way that they did. So really fascinating to see who the leading receivers for Utah are moving forward, but there was that. And then Brian Brown, his first one was leading pass catcher will not be a receiver. He was wrong there, but it wasn't that far off. So Ryan Davis was 725 yards. That number would have been higher if he was healthy all season, obviously. But still, he emerged as a guy that I don't think many were expecting. If anything, many, and I think even I said on the podcast that Tobias Merriweather had the better chance to be that guy just based on his frame. Nobody knew, and obviously that connection didn't really work, and there's a lot of improvements that need to be made for Tobias Merriweather to have that impact. But all in all, I think many expected a guy like J.J. Buchanan, who was listed as a tight end, to kind of be that guy, or Dallin Bentley to be that guy, and Bentley almost was that guy. So you got that. Then going through the snake draft again, Brian said Utah finishes with the top 25 recruiting class. That did not happen. And Utah finished 36th. And, it was good. There was a few key pieces that they missed out on. Obviously, having the Pula twins leave changed that, but Utah was still outside of the top 25, but they were flirting with it a little bit more than they are now. But honestly, based off of the season that Utah had the year prior, so 2024, finishing 36th is a pretty good recruiting ranking for Utah. You obviously sign your first 5-star consensus player. There was a lot of successes there. It just didn't finish in the top 25 class. So really curious to see if they can do that moving forward. My next one was Dylan Curtis, so the freshman place kicker, makes a 60-yard field goal. That did not happen, but it was much closer than many expected. And when he went out there to the field for this, I was kind of getting a little excited because I thought I might get this one done. So he did go. He had 2 field goals made over 50 yards out of 3 attempts. So his first one was a 54-yarder at UCLA. So right off at the beginning, kicked a deep bomb. And then at Colorado, he had 2 50-plus yard kicks, one at 53 that he made. And then the one that got me excited was the 59-yarder, but he missed it short. But it was right down the middle. And if he had a little bit more leg on it, he definitely makes that. And, I would have counted that a win because 59, 60, that's basically the same thing. It shows what he's capable of. Clearly, there was some inconsistencies, and there's some reasons for that. But, I think Utah's in a good spot with Dylan Curtis. And the more he grows and matures in the program and has some of the support that he can get, I think that still can be a realistic opportunity. You just, if you're Utah, you hope you don't have to kick a 60-yard field goal, but, worth a shot. Newman, he decided to go a story or a bold take outside of Utah, and that was Sam Levitt will not throw for 3,000 yards. Now, this one, it's a little janky. Yes, he won this because Sam Levitt got injured and needed surgery. But in 7 games, he threw for 16-28, 10 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. If you were to average out his season, so his average throws, it was like 223, if I'm not mistaken, that he would throw for a game. If you did that, he would average about 20, or he would have finished at about 27.91 without a bowl game. With a bowl game, assuming that he stayed on average, he probably would have hit 3,000, but it would have been close. So even if he played all the games, I think that one actually could have been a decent pick for Newman. He obviously wins it because he didn't get it, but I think there's some nuance there, obviously. His next one is that at some point, Newman will show up at Rice-Eccles Stadium this year. He did not tell me this before this, so this was a surprise to me, but in fact, he did show up to the Arizona State game. I paid for him to come out to Rice-Eccles Stadium and be back in the building for a game. And, obviously a great reporter, does exactly what he needs to connect with people, but also just to tell compelling stories to be able to help Utah fans understand what's going on. We got a little extra treat because we got him to the Baylor game as well. Granted, that was, about an hour and a half away from his home in Austin, Texas. So, we got treated with a double dipping level of Newman, but glad to see that one come because I think he's really talented. He's now got another job officially where he's now moving to Cleveland. So all the best for Newman. Really excited for him. There may be still some potential where he contributes for us over the years, but for the most part, he's now going to focus on his job, and happy for him because he deserves it all. My last one is Utah's offensive line allows 2 or less sacks to Devin Dampier. Now, this was one of the hottest takes of all time. And I got mocked for it a little bit, but, it was meant to be more of an indication of how good Utah's offensive line could be. And obviously, we saw how good they were. Spencer Fano obviously is a unanimous All-American. He wins a top college football award. He's all of these things. The offensive line was just this phenomenal team. Should have been a Joe Moore Award finalist, but they weren't for some reason. This offensive line absolutely did everything it needed to. Now, Utah finishes the year with 14 sacks, which is actually 11th in the country, so it really wasn't that many. Dampier took 8 of those sacks, but when you look at it, not all 8 of those were because of the offensive line. Some of them were because he rolled out or did different things that weren't in particular with the offensive line. So I had to go to PFF to see how this all shook out. And when you look at the defensive or the offensive line pressures and the sacks that were given up by the offensive line, and this one also gets a little tricky, Utah gave up 2 sacks from its offensive line. And the funny part of that is one of those sacks was from the actual offensive line. The other was from Nakari Rogers, who gave up the sack. So at least he was attributed for it. So in some ways I'm right. In some ways I'm wrong. I'll let you decide what that is. I tend to believe I was right because clearly I was. And no. But I think that was kind of showed the impact that offensive line had. They clearly did everything they needed to keep Devin Dampier upright or whomever was in the backfield. Yes, the whole season there was 14 sacks taken, but if you look at the PFF grades who attribute these, by going back and watching the film, only one of those was actually attributed to the offensive line. So, like I said, I'm right. The rest of the world is wrong, and you all can deal with that. Army wins the season by only allowing 7 sacks in total. So clearly, there's different things there, but I think that's a fun step. And lastly, from Brian, Utah wins the regular season championship, loses the title game, gets an at-large bid in the playoff. That's a big nope. Obviously, they were in the mix for that, and they just lost the wrong games, right? You lose to Texas Tech and BYU, who were in the Big 12 title game, and you can't do that if you want to be able to get into the title game. So it just so happened that you lose to the wrong teams. Had you have lost to some other team, maybe there's a better shot. Even then, BYU only lost 1 game, and that was to Texas Tech, so that was tough. Texas Tech only lost to Arizona State. So, there was a lot going against Utah in that situation. But I think for Utah to be in the mix after their 5-7 season the year before, really shows kind of the improvement and what Utah was able to do, building through the transfer portal and everything that way. So obviously did not get the title game, did not get the playoff bid, but you're in the mix. And like I said, you finished in the top 15 in the college football playoff rankings as well as in the Associated Press rankings. So all in all, a successful season. Hopefully, you had some fun with some of those. There's a lot of nuances to some of those things, but I hope to do something similar this year with some other people. Now that I'll be joining forces with Steve Bartle, maybe we can do our own predictions, bold takes later on in the year. But I appreciate everybody that listens to this podcast. It's a lot of fun to be able to talk football year round. Like I said, we'll sprinkle in maybe some other sports here, men's basketball, gymnastics, women's basketball, anything else that's going on, we'll try to sprinkle in. But I still want to keep this primarily football focused because it's fun to talk about, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. Really looking forward to see how Morgan Scalley approaches all this and how he approaches the fans, how he approaches the media. I've heard positive things about both of those and how he wants to include and be more open. Curious to see how that all works, and mostly curious about how spring goes, because now that there's no spring portal, Morgan can be, a little bit more fluid with how he does things. You can see some of these guys be a little bit more impactful and not try to hide them in spring scenarios. So really curious to see how this all comes together. Like I said, we'll continue this podcast through the off season. My goal is to do these probably every Wednesday now, so we'll shift that schedule a little bit. That may change depending on what's going on, but we're going to keep going at this. And if there's anything that you want me to chat about, as the off season goes on, things that you want me to look at, happy to talk about these things. So hit me up on email, jfurlong@ksl.com. Hit me up on Twitter, Blue Sky, wherever you want. Happy to chat about these things and bring these up on the podcast and maybe do a little deeper dives on some stuff. So with that said, I appreciate all the time that you guys spend with me. It really does mean a lot. Sometimes this is really challenging to get a podcast out, but I do it because I want to make sure that you can be informed. And hopefully I do inform you to a point where you're not like rolling your eyes saying, I already knew that or something. But always looking to get better. So if there's anything that you want from me, please don't hesitate to let me know. So with that, we'll sign off for another week, and we will catch you again next week. Have a great day.